Hollywood still lit up her name, but inside, Marilyn Monroe was fading. On set, they called her iconic. Photographers begged for one more shot. Directors said, "Give us that magic smile." But no one asked about Norma Jean, the woman, the pain, the truth. That year, Let's Make Love hit theaters. The posters were bright. The fans were louder than ever. But inside her dressing room, Marilyn stared at her reflection. Eyes tired, smile practiced, a face the world adored, but she barely recognized. "Why does everyone still want me to be Marilyn?" she whispered, "when I'm not even sure I'm Norma anymore?" Behind the scenes, they yelled about her being late. She'd been crying since 3 a.m., but no one cared about the nights filled with pills and silence. Fame was her golden cage, and the world admired its bars. Still, she put on the smile, walked into the light, and gave the world what it wanted. Because sometimes a woman carries the weight of everyone's dreams, even when she's losing her own. But that night, alone, she made a quiet promise. Either I live as who I am, or I vanish as who they want. Her name still sold tickets, but inside, Marilyn was slipping through the cracks of her own spotlight. Each morning began the same: a pill to wake up, a pill to be calm, a pill to forget what the cameras never saw. Reporters followed her every step, snapping photos of a woman in diamonds, never asking why her eyes stopped sparkling. In public, she laughed louder than anyone. In private, she wrote letters she never sent. She told her therapist, "I'm not lonely because I'm alone. I'm lonely because no one sees me." The media called her unstable. Studio execs labeled her difficult. As if her grief had a script to follow. She began canceling appearances. Not because she didn't care, but because her body no longer moved unless her soul begged it to. Still, she showed up. To sets, to interviews, to a life that wasn't hers anymore. One night, under the lights of a gala, as the world clapped for the dress, the hair, the illusion, she whispered to herself, "If I disappeared, would they miss the woman, or just the icon?" And in that moment, even surrounded by hundreds, she had never felt more alone. She stopped reading magazines, stopped watching herself on screen, because all she saw was Marilyn, and all she wanted was Norma. In 1961, she checked herself into a psychiatric clinic. Voluntarily, not because she was broken, but because she was finally done pretending she wasn't. Inside, there were no scripts, no mirrors, just silence. And nurses who didn't care she was famous. The first night, she cried for hours, not from fear, but from relief. She wrote in her notebook, "They stripped me of my image, and for the first time, I'm not scared of what's underneath." Therapy wasn't gentle. It peeled her open, layer by layer. The little girl who lost her mother, the teen who posed to survive, the woman who learned to be adored, but never loved. One day her therapist asked, if Marilyn vanished, what would be left? She didn't answer, but in her silence, something shifted. That night, she looked in the mirror. No lashes, no gloss, no light tricks, just Norma Jean, still breathing. And she whispered, "Maybe I'm not a ghost after all." She began writing again. Not for scripts, not for interviews, just for herself. Loose pages scattered across her nightstand, tucked inside books, under pillows, like fragments of a woman trying to remember she was real. Each letter had a name, but none were mailed. To the director who said I was only a body, I hope someday you feel what it's like to be seen but never heard. To the boy I loved at 17, you kissed me like I mattered. Thank you. That memory feeds me when I starve. To the girl I used to be, You were never weak. They just told you being soft was a flaw. The letters weren't polished. They were raw, misspelled, honest. They weren't meant for the world. They were meant for the parts of herself she'd abandoned. One night, after writing until dawn, she stood at her window as the sky turned blue and whispered, "Maybe my story isn't done yet. Maybe I get to finish it. My way." And though no one would ever read those letters, each one was a quiet rebellion, proof that behind the myth, a woman was still fighting to be whole. She turned down 3 roles, not because she couldn't play them, but because they weren't worth her anymore. 1962 came with new headlines. Marilyn returns. But she knew better. She wasn't returning. She was rebuilding. She began training again. Voice, movement, acting coaches. No more improvising her pain on camera. This time, every scene would be hers. Studios didn't know what to do with this version of her. Confident, clear-eyed, demanding respect. One producer said, "You're not the same." She smiled. "That's the point." She met with authors, painters, poets, surrounded herself with people who didn't need her to sparkle, only to speak. At night, she read Rilke and wrote monologues for herself. She even called her therapist just to say, "I want to live a life I remember, not one I performed." There was a quiet strength in her now. Not loud, not manic, just steady. And even if the world still saw her as a symbol, she had found something deeper, a self that didn't need applause to feel real. Her last day was quiet. No big parties, no final photos. Just a few phone calls and a yellow notepad by her bedside, half a poem, half a goodbye. She wore her favorite silk robe, the one that felt like memory. Opened the windows wide as if letting the world in one last time. She called her acting coach, left a message about a new idea she had. Something about a woman who disappears, but not because she's weak. That night she lit a single candle, not for drama, but for warmth, the kind she had given away too many times, and finally kept for herself. The pills were there, but so was a stack of fresh scripts. One of them had her name handwritten in bold. She was difficult, they'd once said, too sensitive, too late, too much. But the truth? She was a woman who learned to stand up in heels made of expectation. She didn't die empty, she died fighting. And when the world woke up to the news, they mourned the star they thought they knew. But in her silence, she left behind something louder than legacy. Proof that softness is not weakness, that beauty is not surrender, and that even in her final hour, she was still becoming. She wasn't lost. She was learning to be whole in a world that only wanted her in pieces.